I got trust issues. You got trust issues. We all have trust issues. The question is, what can we do about our issues?
Welcome to a podcast about disciple making in the public square, where we talk about everyday issues from a biblical and balanced perspective. This is where life exists.
This is where life exists, where we talk about everyday issues from a biblical and balanced perspective. My name is Dhati. I am the lead pastor of Blueprint Church and the vice president of the Sin Network. And today we're going to be talking about overcoming our trust issues, or another way of putting it is how to establish trustworthy relationships. Let me just start with this. Partial trust is not trust at all. Either you are trustworthy or you're not. If you can't be trusted with all, you can't be trusted at all. That may sound a little harsh, but let me put it this way when it comes to our relationship with God. Partial trust is not trust at all. Either God is trustworthy or he is not. If God cannot be trusted with all, he cannot be trusted at all. I know that's pretty extreme, but I also know that we wrestle with this tension between trust, and a lot of our trust issues are the trust that we have between God. We apply it to man. I want to talk to you about how we can start to rebuild trustworthy relationships. The points that I'm going to be talking about today comes from Proverbs 3, 1 through 12. And again, Proverbs 3, let me be clear, is about our trusting God. But I hope to build a bridge on how trusting God impacts how we are trusting one another. Let me just kind of start with giving you a framework of what Proverbs 3, 1 through 12 states. There are basically 5 warnings, there are 5 exhortations, and there are 5 results of what trusting the Lord really looks like. So let's start with the 5 warnings. You can read this as you go back, but it talks about a few things. Don't forget the teaching. Don't let loyalty and faithfulness leave you. It tells us not to rely on our own understanding. It also tells us not to be wise in our own eyes, or not to think little of the Lord's instruction. So they give us these 5 warnings, but paired with the 5 warnings are 5 exhortations or 5 encouragements that they give us in these first 12 verses. It tells us to keep heart. It also tells us to tie these things around our neck, write them on the tablet of our hearts. It tells us explicitly to trust in the Lord with all of our heart and in all of our ways to acknowledge him or to know him. It tells us to fear the Lord and to turn away from evil. It calls us to honor the Lord with all of our possessions, with the first produce of our entire harvest. But what I love about the passage is that it gives us these 5 warnings, but it also gives us these 5 exhortations. But the reason why it gives it to us is because God wants us to live fully, and trust is at the center of living fully. Why? Is because we see in the passage, it says trusting will bring a full life and well-being. And then it also tells us this idea of finding favor, that we will find favor in high regard, both with God and with people. You see that bridge that it talks about in trusting the Lord and holding on to him, that will bring both favor with God and people. And it tells us that it will make our paths straight. It will be healing for our body. It will be strength for our bones. It tells us to understand that the Lord disciplines the one he loves in the same way a father disciplines a son in whom he delights in. I want to hone in on a passage in verses 1 through 12 that it's a verse that many of us memorize. For many of us, it's our life verses. And that life verse is trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding, but in all your ways know him. And it tells us he will make our paths straight. So you see in these verses 5 and 6, these are best known, these are memorized verses, one of the, that we see all throughout Proverbs. In fact, they are the life verses, as I've already said, for many of us, but these 2 cherished verses describe a life of total dependence and total commitment to God. It calls us to both trust and to lean in on God. These 2 words are very close in meaning. To trust and to lean are close. Trusting means to put oneself wholly at the mercy of another. Leaning is not just talking about reclining against something, but it's really relying on its total support of you. And it's telling us to put all of our trust in the Lord, and that true trust and true faith has no plan B. But the question you still may be asking is, what does trusting God have to do with me trusting people? Because it's real easy for us to say, I'm trusting God, but I know you're not asking me to trust people in the same way we're trusting God. Let me just put it this way. Trust is the foundation to everything we do. You cannot quarantine your trust. And our trust with God and our trust for God has everything to do with how we kind of engage in life. Let me give you an example. A person who's trusting God to provide a spouse. We see this oftentimes. It's like, okay, I trust God to provide a spouse for me, but I'm going to do all these things in order to kind of manipulate the situation in order to get it. One author just puts it this way when it comes to this idea of trust. There are always two sides to the matter of trust. There is the decision of trust, and then there's the habit of trust. The first one is a call for commitment, and the second one is a call basically for discipline, right? Trust follows commitment, but it not always the right way, but it begins there. And that's where we got to recognize that when we start with trust, we begin with this idea of a commitment to trust, but then there's a discipline to maintain trust over suspicion as we live throughout lives. We do it all the time. We recognize it's like, yes, I trust God for this, but will he do it again? Will he show up again? And what happens is that in the middle of our fears, we make a decision. We have to make a decision to continue to trust God. This does not immediately bring the habit of trust, but we must muster up the courage to commit our way to God over and over and over again. So it's really important for us to both commit to trusting God, but also continue in trusting God. This is what happens with Abraham. Abraham trusted God. God told Abraham, hey, I'm going to give you a son, right? But guess what? 27 years later, guess what Abraham didn't have? He did not have a son. So they started thinking through, okay, well, maybe we misheard God, or maybe God needed our help. They started leaning on their own understanding. And this is what the passage is saying. It's saying, fully trust God and don't lean on your own understanding. In that case, what Abraham needed, he both needed to trust God at the beginning, but he needed to create that discipline of trust that was going to especially expand beyond the realm that he thought it was supposed to take place. So what am I saying is that trust must be both a commitment of your will and a discipline to walk in it, because this is about spiritual warfare. So what does this look like? What does this mean with trust? We got to recognize that the goal of the enemy is to erode the trust that we have with God. Ever since the garden, if you remember, what was the serpent trying to do? He says, did God really say? Does God really want what's best for you? Really what he was saying is that, can we trust God? Or is he holding something back from us? This is really important for us because as we relate to God vertically, that impacts our relationships horizontally. When we stopped trusting God, it began us to hide ourselves from God, but it also caused us to hide ourselves from one another. So we got to recognize that trust is the belief that God has our best interests at heart. It's what the Bible talks about as God's hesed love. It talks about trusting in God's currency to righteousness, right? This is what it is. It's a covenantal love. It's a commitment. It's basically him saying his vows to us that he will never leave us. He will never forsake us. But the question becomes do we trust him? Because if we don't trust him, it is going to cause us to not trust anyone else. And we're going to be vigilant in all other circumstances. And so it is important for us to begin our trust relationship with God. And then as we create that trustworthy relationship, it will cause us to create trustworthy environments for ourselves and for others to be involved. There's three questions that you need to ask yourself, three trustworthy questions that you need to ask yourself. Number one is, are you trustworthy? Right? This is just the basic golden rule, right? Treat others in the way that you want to be treated. Are you trustworthy? The second question is, are people from your past trustworthy? This is an important question because people from your past is going to influence how you see people that you engage with today. So you got to be able to understand your story to understand how you're looking at other people. The third thing is your current environment trustworthy? You and I are always asking a question. The question that we are constantly asking is it safe? And the other question is, do you really care? Those are two questions. And basically you're asking yourself the question is this environment trustworthy? Because that is going to show whether you are willing to show up. So let me just end with this. There are four things that we just need to look at, and how do we cultivate trustworthy environments, or how do we become trustworthy people, cultivate other trustworthy people so that we can have trustworthy environments. And we need to be these four. Number one, we need to be authentic people. What do I mean by authentic people? We need to be willing to be upfront, willing to have healthy confrontations, healthy conflict, able to speak the truth in love to one another, right? But not only do we need to be honest with the story that we're telling ourselves, but we need to be able to express that story in ways that is clear. So we got to be authentic. Tell the truth about the story that's going on inside. The second thing that we have to look at is being empathetic people. And empathetic means able to be present with our own life and the ability to be able to empathize with the life of others. Like, the only way I can empathize with somebody else's hurt is if that I am willing to understand what was it like for me to be hurt. So we need to be authentic with our stories and what's going on, but we also need to be empathetic with other people's story so that we can be able to empathize with them in order to be present with how that story ultimately is making you feel, right? The third one is we need to be responsible people. We need to take ownership and stop demanding that other people fix us. We gotta stop demanding that people fix us, because what we're doing is like, I'm just gonna keep it real, and every time we talk about keeping it real, what ends up happening is that I just got things to get off my chest. But that's not taking responsibility. We need to be responsible in taking ownership of where we are and stop demanding other people to fix us. We need to be clear with what you are hoping for. That's one thing, because obviously there's the burden of pain that you're hoping for something that you're not getting, but we need to be honest with what we specifically need. And the more honest that you're able to say what you need, the better. You're able to create a trusting or trustworthy environment. So again, let me just recap. We need to be authentic people, we need to be empathetic people, we need to be responsible people, and lastly, we need to be rational people, able to identify the point and what our clear ask is. Like, a lot of times, like, you're just kind of like, you want people to guess what's going on in your minds. If you're like me, that's why I was like, because we feel like we're more loved if you're able to guess what's going on in my heart and guess my needs and guess what I need. That's just a wrong way, and that's not creating a trustworthy environment. What that is building is a codependent environment. We don't need to build codependent environments. We need to build trustworthy environments. So that means we got to be clear with our expectations, clear with what we're asking. What I'm ultimately saying is that we need to choose trustworthy people because they tend to be trustworthy. We need to choose healthy environments and healthy teams and healthy people because those things are blessed people. This is the default that we have to move towards. If we're going to create trustworthy environments, we have to choose trust over suspicion. Thank you for tuning in for another episode of Where Life Exists, where we talk about everyday issues from a biblical and balanced perspective.